Lesson 9, the purpose of suffering. Reading is 1 Peter 4. Anselm Brewer tells a story of a friend whom he has very rarely seen smiling, except in a kind, polite way. Just before he got to know him, he was on a picnic with his family beside a river. His boys were playing, and despite being warned to be careful, one fell in. This river is beautiful, but fast and deep and very dangerous. Their oldest son dove in to help his brother, but he soon was in trouble. For a time it looked like both were going to drown, but somehow the younger one got out. Their oldest son died there, and Anselm Brewer's friend and his family had to stand by helplessly. They longed to throw themselves in, but they knew that they would merely die with him. This friend was a Christian, and he and his whole family were still strong believers. What do you say to someone in such a situation? The stock answers that you hear are, 1, what happened was God's will and it is all for the ultimate good. 2, this is a punishment or a message from God to teach you something. 3, if you had enough faith, your prayers would have stopped it from happening. Now, who would be crass enough to say anything like that in this situation? Who knows what to say to someone who has suffered in that way? Peter decided to have a go at it in 1 Peter 4. And what he says sounds very strange to us. Not because it's difficult. He speaks plainly, with examples we can understand. It sounds strange because it is the opposite of what we often hear preached in church. But the fact that Peter has the courage to say it gives me a little courage to speak. It's not that Peter says things which are different from the rest of the Bible. Peter agrees with the rest of Scripture, but he doesn't agree with most preachers. The question is often framed as, how can a God of love allow suffering to happen? And this is usually answered by Christians in 1 or 2 of 3 ways. God is all-powerful, so God has produced the suffering and that it is for our good. 2, God is all-powerful and suffering is wrong, so God will remove it if we ask with enough faith. 3, God cannot do everything, and the world is fallen, and so God can only help us put up with the sufferings and show us that he cares by sending his son to suffer. The conclusion that Anselm Brewer comes to is that none of these are right, and that the truth is actually rather horrific. 4, God can do everything, and yet he often chooses to stand by and do nothing, even though he loves us and he longs to keep us from harm and from sadness. In other words, God is like Anselm Brewer's friend who had to watch his son die, helpless to do anything. But for God it is worse. He watches with the same heartache, but able to stop it. Why? I'll come to that, but first, let's see what Peter says. Peter's writing to a community that has suffered a great deal already. He openly acknowledges that they have been grieved by various trials. 1 Peter 1:6. Chapter 2 hints that many of them are slaves with cruel masters who beat them. 1 Peter 2:20. Chapter 4 goes through a catalog of different types of suffering, both minor and major. Minor suffering, such as showing hospitality to unwanted guests. Verse 9 states, show hospitality to one another without grumbling. As the saying goes, guests are like fish. After 2 or 3 days, they start to stink. But hospitality was necessary when most inns were lightly disguised brothels. Another minor source of suffering was the Christian lifestyle. I don't mean attending church, but not attending parties and public feasts. A meal, even at respectable homes, ended with a symposium, a drinking party, or if it was a higher class party, it ended with after dinners or prostitutes. These were not the street prostitutes but highly trained, clean, and respectable. But Peter said, none of this is for us, now that we are Christians. Verse 3 states, sensuality, lust, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to these, they are surprised you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. Suffering, yes, we should accept that Christians have to give up some things. But these are very minor inconveniences compared to the major sources of suffering. Peter also talks about fiery trials in verse 12, being insulted for the name of Christ, verse 14, and suffering as a Christian, verse 16. That was a real fear for Peter's flock, because Christianity was illegal. You could worship who you liked, but you had to also worship the emperors. The Jews were okay, their religion was official, and the Romans excused them. They knew that they had a temple and a religion which didn't allow other gods. But Christians were what the Romans called atheists. They had no gods or temple. And they refused to worship the emperor, so they must be criminals. We have the record of Pliny, who was sent by the emperor Trajan to find the truth. He said he arrested a couple of their ministers and questioned them under torture. These ministers were women and probably slaves, like Peter's flock. We know that they were women because Pliny used the female form ministre. And we know that they were slaves because he tortured them, which was perfectly correct and often a legal necessity when questioning slaves at that time and in their culture. He reported back that these Christians meet to sing worship to Christ as a God, and that they bow to each other to do good and to avoid evil. Pliny concluded that they were harmless, but faithfully carried out the emperor's orders by imprisoning those who refused to desist from this suspicious cult. Peter says that they should not be surprised when they suffer this kind of thing. God warned that Adam and Eve that they would suffer pain after the fall. When Adam and Eve sinned, they were told that now everything will go wrong. From now on, creation will be dysfunctional and will work against humans. Birth will be hard and often dangerous for humans, much more so than other animals. And weeds will grow more easily than food, unless we fight them laboriously. And even human relationships will be hard work and involve emotional pain. Eve was told, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. In other words, families will be dysfunctional and problematic as the rest of creation. And relationships will be a source of the most profound pain that we suffer. But we can cope with most of this pain because there's a goal and an aim behind it. It's not easy facing any kind of pain and suffering, but a purpose makes it easier. The pain of childbirth or a farmer's backache is bearable because of its results. The pain of an athlete's muscles is easier to bear because it marks achievement. Even the pain of a broken relationship or unrequited love is ultimately bearable because the risk is worth the chance of gaining the ultimate prize of mutual love. But what about suffering which has no purpose, which simply happens? What about the arthritic pain which occurs whenever you move and also when you keep still? Why the despair of depression isolating you from humanity with no apparent cause? What's the purpose of a painful terminal illness, suffering of which will only be relieved by death? How do you explain the unfixable painful void left by bereavement, or worse, by abandonment? And there's the worst pain of all, watching a loved one suffering. How can we cope with these? And what can we say to someone suffering like this? What does Peter say? He says that they have now reached their purpose in life. Verse 13 says, rejoice because you are now sharing in Christ's sufferings. Verse 1 through 2 explains, whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time, no longer for human longings, but for the will of God. What does he mean? What does he mean that God has sent this suffering especially? Well, James might be thought to imply this when he says in James 1:12, Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has withstood it, he will receive the crown of life, which God promised for those who love him. But James warns people not to conclude that God sent the suffering of the trial. Verse 13 goes on to say, let no one say that when he is tested, I am tested by God. For God cannot be tested, and he himself tests no one. Trial and testing are the same Greek word. James regarded suffering as a test by God, but says God is not the source of the test. He says that God is the sender of all good and not evil. He does not send evil on us. This is written in James 1:17. From above comes every good gift and every perfect gift. So why do Peter and James think it is so wonderful to suffer pain and trials? Do they mean that God uses suffering to purify them from sin? Peter appears to imply this in chapter 1:6. You have been grieved by various trials so that the tested genuineness of your faith may be more precious than gold, refined by fire. So does this mean that suffering comes as a result of sin and suffering cleanses it? This is what Job's friends spent 34 chapters trying to convince him of. Their argument in one sentence is, you must have done something wrong because God brings good on the righteous and he punishes the sinners with evil. But God says to them in Job 42:7, I am angry with you because you have not spoken of me what is right. They got it wrong. God does not bring evil on sinners to punish them. Well, not in general. But in the Bible, God does often punish people with disasters. For example, we read that God punished Pharaoh and sinful Israel, but that it was always after many warnings, and so when it happened, they knew exactly why. God would be a terrible parent if he punished his children without warning. It's like getting a clip around the ear without knowing what they'd done wrong. You'd never learn what was wrong. You'd only learn to avoid getting within reach. God is a good parent who warns his children and he helps them change their ways. And he only punishes or chastises them after many warnings and corrections. So if you aren't sure what you have done wrong, it's not a punishment from God. So why has suffering come, or why has God allowed it to come, particularly on me? That's what Job repeatedly asked God, and God eventually answered him. But he answered him with questions. Do you know how big the universe is? Do you understand it? Do you have the power to create it and keep it running? When Job admitted his ignorance, God declined to explain suffering to him. What? No explanation? I find this exasperating beyond measure. Why no answer? Is the explanation too complicated? Is the implication of God's answer to Job? It's none of our business, probably, but there's no hint that God deliberately hides it. Is the answer unbearable? Probably, while we're here in these bodies. I suspect that we are intelligent enough to partly understand, but not strong enough. Peter forever returns to Christ's suffering on the cross. If we suffer, we are closer to Christ who suffered for us and didn't give in. If we suffer, we understand a little bit about what Jesus went through. The connection with the cross is not immediately obvious. It may be too painful. You probably know Moltmann's concept that God the Father suffered when Jesus died. So the whole Trinity was involved in the death on the cross. But this implies something very profound about the painfulness of the cross. To see it, think of my friend who stood helpless watching his son drown. Now think of God who watches Jesus die and suffers all the same heartache. But now consider that God is not helpless. He could step in at any time and stop it. Now multiply that, because the cross is in some ways only the visible pain of God. Because God loves us and knows our suffering, he feels the same pain constantly, knowing that he could intervene, and yet, for a reason we don't know yet, mustn't. At least on most occasions. Now, sometimes he intervenes with a marvelous miracle, which only makes it worse that he has to stand by and see the others suffer. That seems to me to be unbearable pain, and I'm glad I have no experience of it. Now look back at Jesus. At any time, he could have said, "Stop, I don't want to continue." This is like someone who's being tortured and told all the time, "You could stop this. Just tell us what we want, and we will stop." And the person longs for death to end it. Jesus was tortured for us, and he must have longed for death long before it came. Jesus foresaw this terrible suffering when in Gethsemane, and he wanted to die. He said to his disciples, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here with me." Matthew 26:38. In other words, "I am so sad, I want to be dead. Don't leave me." And what did they do? They were so concerned that they fell asleep. I think that may have been harder than the actual pain and humiliation of the cross. Job also suffered terribly that he wanted to die, and his wife said, "Do it. Curse God and die." In other words, kill yourself, even though you know it's against God's will. And Peter addresses those who have suffered in the flesh, for whom life is over. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, and so as to live the rest of your life for the will of God. 1 Peter 4:1. They had suffered to the point where they wanted to die, but they hadn't given in. After that, what more could the world, their flesh, or the devil throw at them? They have, as Peter said, ceased from sin and live only for the will of God. If they had been on a battlefield, they would have been awarded a medal of bravery. Even if they died, they would get it after their death to recognize their unyielding suffering. But because they are in a hospital bed or in their home alone, they are ignored. But let me remind you where you are. You are on a battlefield. Let me remind you why we are suffering. The world is under enemy occupation. Let me remind you who we are. We are God's servants within enemy's territory. And let me remind you of the aim of history, that Jesus will return and defeat Satan. We are soldiers behind enemy lines and taking casualties at a terrible rate. In some countries, we are attacked with baseball bats, bullets, and prison. In other countries, we are attacked with enticements, bribery, and moral corruption. We may want to abandon our post when we are injured or ill or just fed up. We will still be welcomed home for having fought, but we won't be the heroes. The heroes will be those who continued against unstoppable odds, who stayed at their post when they were ill, in pain, and despair with nothing left. They didn't choose to be there. They didn't plan the injury or the illness or the pain. But what made them heroes is the way that they dealt with it. They didn't give in. They continued to be faithful to the end, always looking out for what they could do, or just continuing faithful often to the end. They will be the heroes in heaven. Because what makes our suffering different from other believers is what follows. This life is not the end, but only the opening stunt at the start of an action movie. It is the overture before the opera, the quick taste before eating the meal. The best is yet to come, and it will last much, much longer. That's what Peter says. They're surprised when you don't join them in their debauchery, verse 4. If this life is all there is, the main aim is to enjoy it while you can. Instead, Peter says, when the fiery trial comes upon you, rejoice. Because this is part of your life, the bit on earth. It is the only place to earn a medal. And you can't plan to earn one. Something dramatic has to happen to you. And then you can earn a medal by continuing bravely through whatever it is. So when that fiery trial comes, rejoice that you have the opportunity to shine. And grit your teeth, because it won't be easy. Worthwhile things never are.